Hello, I'm Lee Bernick, Dean of the Greenspan College of Urban Affairs, and I want to welcome you to another edition of the Urban Report, a program dedicated to looking at how the University of Nevada, Las Vegas interacts with the city and the metropolitan area. Today we have as a guest, a special guest for us, a new member of the faculty at the university, Rob Lang. Rob, I want to welcome you to the show. Rob has got a series of titles here. Not only is he a professor of sociology, he's the director of the Mountain West, Brookings Mountain West, and he is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. So we want to welcome you.
Thanks for
Rob.
having me.
Rob, let's do a couple things here. First, you're associated with the Brookings Institution. What's the Brookings Institution?
The Brookings Institution is the country's oldest, in some ways most prestigious think tank. It was founded in the early 20th century and is almost like a university within Washington, and is active in all areas of public policy, foreign affairs, and I'm associated with the Metropolitan Policy Unit, which was begun in 1996, and I have been associated with them since they were founded.
The metropolitan area?
The Metropolitan Policy Unit, it's called.
You're not 100 years old.
I am not 100 years old. I'm working on it, though.
You're working.
I'm heading that way.
Okay. Let's talk, and they've published a series of books that you have written, and you are a senior non-resident. What is a senior non-resident?
Well, I'm no longer there, so I'm not in residence.
Okay.
I'm here. I'm resident in this space. It means a senior fellow means you're equivalent of senior faculty. You're somebody who would be a full professor in a university, and there's about 15 non-resident folks that participate within the larger Brookings, and I think there's 3 within the Metropolitan Policy area.
Okay. Let's talk about Brookings Mountain West, and it's here. And what does it mean for UNLV to have Brookings Mountain West here?
Well, let me go back a little about the origins, if I will,
Okay.
and then I'll explain what I think the benefits of Brookings Mountain West are. The Brookings Metropolitan Policy area focused mostly on the Northeast and Midwest. That's where a lot of the kind of, first off, the foundation support is, to go and engage with projects and local governments and so on. The Sun Belt, was booming. Things were moving pretty good on their own. There wasn't a lot of, bail us out, we're Cleveland, we need some help here. Nonetheless, some of the folks within Brookings were interested in topics like sprawl, were interested in, fast metropolitan growth. I was especially. So from the beginning, I was always writing books and articles for them on that topic. So I was looking at the Phoenixes and Orlandos and places like that. And as the old Brookings dealt with the country where, baseball used to be from St. Louis to Boston, till the 1950s. They dealt in that kind of space. So the Mountain West came out of an idea that this area, especially places like Las Vegas and Phoenix and Salt Lake, hardly anyone in DC was sort of paying attention. It just wasn't on their policy radar. So it was an effort to bring attention to those places within Washington, D.C., and to argue that these are places that deserve a lot of focus now, especially. This is just prior to the bust, really, because they had grown so much and there was a large deficit, especially in infrastructure investment. So the Brookings Mountain West came out of that project. It came out of the Mountain Megas report, as we called it.
Right. We'll get back to the report here in a minute.
Yeah, and it came out of that project, and the purpose of it was to do just that, to establish a policy hub in the Intermountain West, and to argue that these cities, these groups of cities that are in the Intermountain West, including places like Denver and Albuquerque as well, all the way up to Boise, have a special set of needs and should be understood on their own terms. They don't, to remake them does not mean to make little Bostons out of them. They have a whole different urban design, and they have a whole different economy. And we wanted to explore the region on its own terms rather than impose an Eastern model within this space.
Okay. So we have the Mountain West, Mega Mountain West, and we'll get back to this report in a minute. So we have the report. There's a great deal of discussion about the report, but the university says maybe we should participate in a major way in this. And we've now worked with, and we now have Brookings here. Brookings doesn't tend to have places around the country, lots of places around the country as outposts, if you will. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so we're one of the few places. And what does that mean, do you think, for us? What does Brookings bring to UNLV?
It brings immediate access to the policy discussion back in Washington, which, and I think fairly it's argued is in some ways impenetrable from the outside. There is an old expression, inside the Beltway, referring to the Washington Beltway. And, Washington, is a kind of place where people are clamoring to be heard. They're lobbying, as you can imagine, as we all know. And what Brookings can bring is, by having a kind of an outpost in the West and having us give them directly back information and to voice the concerns of this region, quite frankly, we have better access to the people in Washington who are decision makers, who are going to look seriously at the set of issues that relate to not just this region, I think, but parts of the Sun Belt, even in the East, like Central Florida, like parts of Texas as well. That's, again, there's a kind of focus in urban policy in Washington towards cities that once held large stocks of public housing, let's say. And I think that, it's the assumption has been, the folks in these regions are part of a boom and they've been, able to make it on their own. And yet, as I say, we're missing basic things like, how about an interstate link to Phoenix? No one thinks about that in the East. If this were between Charlotte and Atlanta, which immediately got, of course, an interstate link, I could imagine that the discussion might be a little different.
Okay. Well, we'll get back to that. So you've mentioned Phoenix and you've mentioned Las Vegas. The mountain megas, and this is the brief version of this, and people could write to the university and get a copy of this. Is that?
It's online.
It's online. So you can
download
go online, go to the university, and then go to
Brookings Mountain West,
and you can download it if you want to read it.
And the whole report you can download too, the 70-something page version.
77. Okay.
And that's the executive summary.
This is the executive summary. But let's talk about this. There are several things I want to mention. First of all, what are the mountain megas? You've mentioned Phoenix and you mentioned Las Vegas. So what are we talking about in this mountain megas?
There are 5 mountain megas as identified in there, and they include Salt Lake, Denver, and Albuquerque, along with Las Vegas and Phoenix. And the term comes from the coinage, which I have, and I'm writing a book on with a colleague at Salt Lake, as a matter of fact, called megapolitan areas. And this is especially specific to the discussion of, the sort of Intermountain West being left out of policy. The Regional Plan Association of New York and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, which is in Boston but in Phoenix as well, by the way, worked on a project that looked at mega regions, and in it they had no representation in the entire Mountain West.
In the Mountain West.
You jump from Dallas to Los Angeles, basically. And so we said, wait a minute, there are regions at scale that will go to over 5 million, especially Phoenix combined with Tucson and the Front Range of the Rockies, all the way really from Fort Collins down to Colorado Springs, go to like 7, 8 million by mid-century. And this region gets to 4 million, 4.2, depending on which year you're looking at. I know right now it seems hard to believe because we're in this kind of morass, in this downturn, but when growth starts again, it's likely that this region at some point could add 1 million, could add 2 million, could double. It's happened before.
Well, let me interrupt you for a second,
Sure.
because we'll talk about that growth in a second. But when you talk about a megapolitan, what do we really mean by it? What distinguishes a megapolitan?
I'll give it to you specifically.
Okay.
The definition is, and it's that you, by 2040, will reach the census definition of a current combined statistical area, as it's referred to. And it's actually based on commuter patterns. So that for example, take Phoenix and Tucson. There's a county in between. Pima County is the south, the big county in the north is Maricopa. Pinal County is in between. And what you have in Pinal are commuters who are mostly going north right now, but are also heading south to Marana in Pima County. In time, as Pinal matures, it's likely that you'll have this technical definition. It's called an employment interchange measure. If you get to 15% of employment interchange, you're technically in a unified, combined metropolitan area. By the way, to give you a recent addition to that list, Providence, Rhode Island, and Boston joined into one recently. Places like Tampa and Orlando, especially now that they're building high-speed rail in between, will likely join. Between them is Polk County, Florida, and has the same thing. People are now commuting from Polk County into Orange County to the big resort complexes and the, kind of kids' theme parks in southwest Orange County. So it is a technically defined term, and we just have it so that you reach a certain scale. Now, the truth is, in the case of Las Vegas, it just gets big on its own. There's no local partner. In a larger sense, Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles are in what some people refer to as not a megapolitan, but a mega region. It's a looser definition. It implies that you have transportation linkages, commuter flights, things like that. That, for example, in Los Angeles, a lot of the folks reside who come here occasionally, do work out of here. If you move a business here, you might leave your accountant back in Los Angeles, for example. When you have an affinity for two regions like that, between two regions like that, there's a special kind of economic linkage, and the government and planners are beginning to recognize this and trying to develop public policy that will help facilitate that scale of metro form.
Okay. So it's a combination of it's just usually more than one city. It's a combination of cities that with areas around them that people transfer back and forth in terms of working and living.
Yeah, we could actually grab St. George.
And say that that's part of ours.
And St. George is going to get a lot bigger. St. George will go to 500,750,000, and depending on what happens north and east of Las Vegas and places like Bunkerville and Mesquite, if you had enough commuting back from Clark into those counties, you'd pick it up. We also just built a bridge that is nearly complete across the Colorado that's going to improve access to Mojave County, Arizona. It's likely that within either this census or probably 2020, you'll find enough evidence from the American Community Survey to indicate that that's a part of the metro as well.
And sooner we might think of Kingman as part of our...
Yeah.
Right?
We already have Pahrump.
Right.
You have Nye because of the commuting back to Las Vegas.
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Inside the report, you talk about one of the things that has distinguished some areas as shock cities. What are shock cities?
The term actually I took from urban historian Robert Fishman, who argued that if somebody saw Manchester, England in like 1835 or 1840 at the peak of its sort of ramp up to the textile industry, you'd be shocked by what you saw. If you saw Los Angeles in 1940, you'd be shocked the same way. It's a city that helps redefine how you think about cities. And in some ways, I argue that Las Vegas constitutes a shock city as well, because again, despite our over-reliance on tourism, we weren't supposed to get to 2 million residents on the basis of an industry like that. It's a surprise in that, the kinds of the economic development that was possible that complemented that in terms of entertainment and, conventions and, even retail sales that you get from people just, being in the city and shopping.
And so but there's something unique about any one of these, quote, shock cities. Mm-hmm. So Los Angeles or now here. And I think you also talk about how one might think of Phoenix, and the Phoenix area is another one of those shock cities, but it's not because of tourism, it's because of the unique quality of the suburbs or the...
Yeah, the metropolitan
But you don't
form.
call them suburbs.
No, I call them boom burbs when they're large, fast-growing. Scottsdale and Mesa,
right.
Places like that. Yeah, the shock of Los Angeles in 1940 was that, let's say your model of looking at a city at that year was Chicago and New York, and you had these high rises, and you didn't have a city at that point. Its suburbs were emerging this way, but the city at that point was not based on the car. And Los Angeles already was based on the car. It was based on the car really from the earliest decades of the 20th century, despite the fact that it had an effective rail network. The citizens sought cars instead. In fact, they were given chances to vote on it, and they voted down their rail system in those years. Part of that is, by the way, just the way real estate speculation worked. People were, buying single-family homes there, and they were, seeking those. Not, they were often people who left the Midwest and small towns. They used to call it Iowa by the sea. So they were not looking for a New York and a Chicago, but the interesting thing was that you could build one of the largest cities in the United States off of that model. So the shock was that you could get to a Chicago or New York scale without the Chicago or New York built form. Even Chicago is different than New York in all kinds of subtle ways. That, in its day, Chicago in the 1890s was really the defining American city. New York had already sort of lost that. In fact, New York City unified into the 5 boroughs because Manhattan was about to be usurped by Chicago as the country's largest city. That was part of the civic pride that they used to appeal to places like Brooklyn and Queens to get them into the city.
Okay. And so we have these 5 regions here, and we can say somewhat that we have a couple shock cities in there. The report also talks about the unique character and culture of the mountain megas. Can we talk about what's unique about the culture and character of the mountain megas?
And I think this applies to the idea of shock cities as well. There is, in a lot of the mountain megas, not as strong a central focus as there is in other metropolitan areas. The reason, for example, Phoenix would be a shock city is that its suburbs in some way contain more key assets from the beginning. LA still, if you look at Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles itself contains the Wilshire Boulevard corridor down to Santa Monica. And the vast majority of the region's key assets are within the city proper. You look at a region like this, well, the Strip's not even in Las Vegas. It's in Clark County, unincorporated. Mm-hmm. And, places like, Phoenix have competitors that are, containing almost as much office space as they do in the case of, say, Scottsdale. What I think is unique about this region is that there is a kind of ethos, a libertarian ethos, that is a really open structure to leadership. It's a place where, by contrast, let's say if you moved to New Orleans and you were somebody who sought to have impact there. I had a friend of mine went there. Ed Blakely was the recovery chief. You got nowhere. They wanted to ask how many generations you went back. And if you didn't, maybe your grandchildren could participate in the leadership. These are open places that are sort of, open to new ideas. You can show up within a week and have an impact in them. And, that's something very positive about them. There is that kind of spirit of the West that even though they're urban, they still have the visuals. They have the mountains in the distance. They still have this sort of idea of openness about them.
Okay. And we've talked about Phoenix, and we've talked about Las Vegas. You have 3 other cities that are part of this, Albuquerque and Denver. And you've mentioned the corridor along Denver, and then we have Salt Lake City. Mm-hmm. Of the 5, besides Phoenix, Albuquerque's the smallest,
By
right,
far.
of the 5. And what do you see with Albuquerque, and how does that fit into this whole idea of megapolitans and where they're going? And
yeah, Albuquerque and Boise are smaller scale. The megapolitan dimension of something like Albuquerque is that Santa Fe, it's the state's state capital, is close enough now to have been linked most recently by rail service. And there are people commuting from Santa Fe back to Albuquerque and in the other direction as well. So those 2 metropolitan areas are on a trajectory to join. And in a sense, they'll form a combined statistical area by about 2030, even though they're smaller than the threshold we established. The truth is, in really Phoenix and Denver are the largest in the West, and Phoenix is the likely candidate to be by far the largest in the entire, inland West, in the entire southern Intermountain West, a kind of inland Los Angeles, and I know that frightens some of the folks in that region as far as those prospects.
To be compared to Los Angeles.
Yeah, Los Angeles is the great stigmatized city of the West now, and it was a time, I think, that people, didn't want to be New York. That's the price of being the shock city from the previous generation. You end up taking on the sort of urban dysfunctions that become very visible in that next generation. And in the case of Los Angeles now, there's folks that are streaming out of Los Angeles. A lot of the original native-born population of Southern California has sought relocation in cities in the rest of the West. I like to describe it as the ones who repent go to Portland. The ones who say, my God, what have we built? The ones that think maybe it just got too big and they could do it right somewhere else go to Las Vegas and Phoenix. They're still sunbelters in a way. They're not moving up to the cold and rain in the Northwest.
They're not going up to the Montana or.
No, they're and we are obviously one of the primary areas of which people migrate to from Southern California. And in the rest of the West, though, there's this kind of, well, you don't want to get to LA. And then in Tucson, they don't want to get to Phoenix,
Mm-hmm. Right.
And in Austin, Texas, they don't want to get to to be Dallas. There's always some city above you that you think has gone too far.
Too far.
Yeah.
and become Los Angeles.
Yeah, and everything, all roads lead to Los Angeles in this
Angeles.
now. It's funny because if you travel around the West with license plates from California, the fear is that you're going to take up residence. You know,
Right.
if you had plates from the East, if you had New York plates on it, you know, you're just passing through. You know, they can't imagine that a New Yorker would want to stop in St. George's, Utah, and turn it into a town, you know, full of strip malls,
Right.
let's say. But if you show up with California plates in the
Yeah.
West, look
Yeah,
out.
there was a former governor of Oregon that talked about not Californizing Oregon. You know, they had big
Yeah.
signs, "We're glad you're here to visit, but don't stay. We don't want Californians."
Right, and they showed the rain and the slugs and things like that, just to remind you that it's not about sunshine up there.
Right.
Mhm.
Let's talk some more about the report and about the mountain megas. And you have the report talks about 3 conclusions that they have. One of them about the surprise, and we've talked about that in terms of its growth. It also talks about some of the unique challenges that we face here. And can we talk about some of those
Sure.
challenges? You mentioned one, and that's the transportation and why
Yeah.
we don't connect to Phoenix.
We
But
grew
can
up too late.
We
you
grew
know.
up too late,
Yeah.
okay.
It's the newest metropolitan region in the U.S. That's what we say, you know, in the report. In that if you look at the age of the existing infrastructure and of, you know, housing stock, things like that, it's really the newest at this scale. You know, Phoenix is the newest at its scale, Las Vegas, and so on. And in some ways, it came of age after the federal government got out of the business of heavy metropolitan investment. It's been in the last several decades where we've, you know, been cutting taxes and so on. So what it missed is, like, we had to build our beltway out of business improvement districts and local taxes that were passed through to homeowners. It puts us at a structural disadvantage because we've used up some taxing capacity for something that other regions were given at 90% from the federal government, 10% local match. And the reason we do not have an interstate to Phoenix is that there was an old census formula that it was based on the 1950 census. The Interstate Act was passed in 1956. And the data to inform it, it was a very logical structure, you know, a national grid, north, south, east, west roads. And the regions that deserve priority in these linkages had 50,000 residents or more, which is the definition of a metropolitan area. So at that point, Las Vegas is so small. By a decade later, it would have been fine, but it's at that point so small that it's really just eligible for kind of a pass-through road on I-15 and not for a linking highway to Phoenix. Phoenix actually is at that scale. And so you have a place like Amarillo, Texas and Lubbock, Texas are connected through an interstate that the federal government paid for because they met the planning criteria under the 50 definition of it. What we argue is, look, people voted. They've decided to live in these big cities. The 2 largest inland southwestern cities, Las Vegas and Phoenix, deserve at least the minimum grade of interstate as a connection between them. They have a highway. It's the kind of highway that Franklin Roosevelt thought you might need instead of Eisenhower thought you might need. We could do better than that. We could have a contemporary highway with more capacity. Also, there's a lot of logistics and there's a lot of goods flow and people movement through these regions. Part of that highway has been identified as the Canamex Freeway connecting through NAFTA, Canada and Mexico. On the Mexican side, they have interstate. It's like they're taking it more seriously than we are. Someday there's going to be a port probably in Mexico. You know, there's so much overload now. There's so much, you know, sort of burden on the Los Angeles ports that there's an argument to be made that we could take a port directly in Mexico and bring goods into the U.S. That would flow through that freeway.
Okay, so that's one
That's
of the
just one,
challenges,
yep.
is the transportation challenge there for us. That's a good local one. Are there other challenges?
Yeah, there's an economic development challenge, which is this region has been working off of, and the other regions as well, except perhaps Denver, a kind of growth model that assumed, you know, well, if you build it, they will come. And it also, in this region, especially Las Vegas, made a bet on people consuming things, you know, consuming a good time even. And the country at this point, you know, is kind of maxed out on its credit card. And the argument is that there's going to have to be a new mix for economic development that includes a greater emphasis on production, on, you know, on making things and selling them somewhere else, as a matter of fact. And one of the great challenges of this region, and we're not alone in this, but of the whole Intermountain West, is to diversify and to add a sort of modern capacity for technology, for manufacturing, for R&D. Right now, the only sort of world-class region in that regard is Denver. Outside of Denver, the rest of the Intermountain West is relatively underdeveloped compared to, like look at the Southeast, look at places like Charlotte and Atlanta, especially, the road all the way between, Raleigh and Atlanta. What's Emory, Georgia Tech, UNC Chapel Hill,
right.
NC State, Duke, they have this sort of institutional strength that's led them to fields like biotech, to telecom and things like that. We've not had that kind of investment.
Okay. And in response to that, I think what the report says, another part of this conclusion, is that we now have to start thinking of a new way of dealing with the federal government and the state and local governments. And we need to see a new partnership in here. Can we talk about
Sure.
that partnership and what that might look like?
And that's really an important leg as well. Look, going back to the libertarian ethos, there's a view here that we could just do this on our own. Well, look at Nevada. How much has it done on its own in the sense? It's done a lot.
Okay.
We're
going to have to, I'm sorry, this is a good place. We now are talking about this, but I think we have to wrap this up. We've had a nice talk. You're here. We can have you in often, and we can talk about Las Vegas and the challenges that we face and the metropolitan connection here. Okay?
Sounds good.
We appreciate you coming. I want to thank the audience, and if you have questions, please email us at lead.bernick@unlv.edu. We'd appreciate hearing from you, and we appreciate you being on the show. And we're going to have you and other members of the Brookings group that come out here on often. Thank you very much for appearing on the show. Thank you.